My name is Evelyn Brooks, and tonight I'm going to tell you about Daniel Moss, a man who built a lighthouse that never touched the ocean. I received his journal in the mail 3 years ago, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string that had gone brittle with age. There was no return address, just a postmark from Bridgewater, Montana, a town I'd never heard of until that package arrived. Inside the journal, pressed between the pages like a dried flower, was a photograph of a man standing next to what looked like a lighthouse, except it was surrounded by wheat fields as far as the eye could see. Daniel Moss was born in 1941 in a fishing village on the coast of Maine. His father was a lighthouse keeper, and Daniel grew up in the shadow of that tower, learning to read the weather in the movement of clouds and the smell of the wind. He told me once, in his journal, that he could close his eyes and know exactly how far the tide had come in just by listening to the way the waves broke against the rocks. When Daniel was 17, his father died in a storm. He'd gone out to check on a fishing boat that had sent up a distress signal, and he never came back. They found his body 3 days later, washed up on a beach 12 miles down the coast. At the funeral, Daniel stood by the coffin and made a promise. He swore he would become a lighthouse keeper, just like his father, that he would spend his life guiding people home through the darkness. But sometimes, life has other plans for us. Sometimes the universe looks at our promises and laughs. In 1962, Daniel was drafted. Vietnam was just beginning to heat up, and young men all across America were being called to fight in a war they didn't understand. Daniel reported for basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the humidity felt like drowning and the red clay stuck to everything. He was assigned to an infantry unit and shipped overseas 6 months later. I won't tell you everything that happened to Daniel in Vietnam. Some stories are too heavy to carry, too dark to speak out loud. But I'll tell you this much. Daniel's unit was ambushed outside a village called Puoc Vinh in the summer of 1963. 15 men went into the jungle that morning. 4 came out. Daniel was one of them. He spent 3 months in a military hospital in Saigon, recovering from injuries that left scars on the outside and wounds on the inside that would never fully heal. When he was finally discharged and sent home, Daniel stepped off the plane in Portland, Maine, and realized he didn't recognize the world anymore. Everything looked the same, the buildings and the streets and the ocean, but it all felt like a photograph of a place he used to know. He went back to the lighthouse, where he'd grown up. The Coast Guard had automated it by then, so there was no keeper anymore, just machinery and silence. Daniel stood at the base of that tower and tried to feel something, anything that connected him to the boy who'd made a promise at his father's funeral. But that boy was gone. He'd died in a jungle on the other side of the world. That's when Daniel started walking. He didn't have a destination in mind. He just knew he couldn't stay in Maine, couldn't live in the shadow of that lighthouse anymore. So he packed a duffel bag with a change of clothes and whatever money he'd saved from his military pay, and he started moving west. He worked odd jobs along the way. He picked apples in New York, hauled lumber in Pennsylvania, washed dishes in Ohio. He never stayed anywhere longer than a few months. People would try to befriend him, ask him questions about where he'd been and what he'd seen, but Daniel had learned in Vietnam that some experiences can't be explained to people who weren't there. So he kept moving. By 1965, Daniel had made it all the way to Montana. He ended up in Bridgewater, a small farming town where the horizon stretched out so flat and endless it made him dizzy. There were no oceans here, no lighthouses, nothing but wheat fields and sky, and a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. He rented a room above a hardware store and took a job at the grain elevator. Every day he'd watch farmers bring in their harvest, watch the wheat pour like golden water into the silos, and he'd think about the ocean he'd left behind, the ocean that had taken his father, the ocean he'd promised to watch over. That's when Daniel had an idea that everyone in Bridgewater thought was crazy. He decided to build a lighthouse, right there in Montana, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. Daniel Moss decided to build a lighthouse in the middle of a wheat field. He bought 5 acres of land on the edge of town. With money he'd saved working double shifts at the grain elevator, he drew up plans based on memories of the lighthouse where he'd grown up, measuring everything in his mind, seeing it all so clearly it was like looking at a photograph. Then he started building. It took him 3 years. Daniel worked on the lighthouse every evening after his shift at the grain elevator, and all day on Sundays. He mixed concrete for the foundation by hand. He hauled stone and timber. He welded metal and laid brick. The people in Bridgewater would drive out to watch him work, shaking their heads, wondering what kind of man builds a lighthouse where there's no water to guide ships home. But Daniel didn't care what they thought. He was building something that made sense to him, something that connected him to the boy he used to be and the father he'd lost. Every brick he laid felt like a prayer. Every stone felt like a promise kept, even if it came too late. The lighthouse was 40 feet tall when Daniel finally finished it in 1968. He installed a rotating light at the top, salvaged from a decommissioned lighthouse in Oregon. He painted the tower white with a red stripe around the middle, just like the lighthouse in Maine. And when he finally flipped the switch and watched that light begin to turn, sweeping across the wheat fields in a steady, faithful circle, Daniel Moss sat down at the base of his lighthouse and cried for the first time since Vietnam. The people in Bridgewater didn't understand it, but they came to respect it. Farmers would use the lighthouse as a landmark when they were working their fields at night. Travelers passing through town would stop to take photographs. Children would ask their parents why there was a lighthouse in Montana, and their parents would tell them about the strange man who built it, the man who never talked about where he'd been or what he'd seen. But here's what nobody in Bridgewater knew. Here's the part that Daniel wrote about in his journal, the part that breaks my heart every time I think about it. Daniel didn't build that lighthouse to guide ships. He built it to guide himself home. You see, after Vietnam, Daniel had nightmares. Every night, he'd close his eyes and find himself back in that jungle, watching his friends die, hearing the sounds that no human being should ever have to hear. He'd wake up in the dark, his heart pounding, not knowing where he was or how to find his way back to anything that felt real. But after he built the lighthouse, Daniel discovered something. If he woke up from a nightmare, he could look out his window and see that light turning in the darkness, that steady, faithful beam sweeping across the wheat fields. And somehow, seeing that light, Daniel could remember who he was. He could find his way back from the jungle, back from the war, back to a world where he was still alive and still had a purpose. The lighthouse became Daniel's anchor, his way of surviving the darkness inside his own mind. He lived in a small house he built next to the lighthouse, and every night he'd climb the stairs to make sure the light was working properly. He'd stand at the top of the tower, looking out across the wheat fields, and he'd think about his father. He'd think about the men who died in Vietnam. He'd think about all the versions of himself that he'd left behind, scattered across the years like stones marking a trail. Daniel lived alone for 15 years. He never married. He never had children. The people in Bridgewater would invite him to church socials and town picnics, but Daniel always declined politely. He wasn't unfriendly, just distant, like someone standing on the far side of a river that nobody else could see. Then, one morning in March of 1983, something happened that changed everything. Daniel was walking through town when he heard screaming coming from the direction of Miller's Creek, a narrow stream that ran through the center of Bridgewater. He ran toward the sound and found a crowd of people standing on the bridge, all of them looking down at the water below. A car had gone through the guardrail and was sinking into the creek. The driver's door was open, and a woman was stumbling onto the bank, soaking wet and bleeding from a cut on her forehead. But she wasn't trying to save herself. She was screaming about her son, about Michael, about how he was still in the car and she couldn't get him out. Daniel didn't think. He just moved. He jumped off the bridge into the freezing water and dove down to the car. The back door was jammed, but Daniel could see a small boy inside, his eyes wide with terror, his hands pressed against the window. The car was filling with water fast. Daniel surfaced, took a breath, and dove again. This time, he used a rock from the creek bed to smash the window. The glass shattered, and water rushed in. But Daniel reached through and grabbed the boy, pulling him out just as the car settled into the mud at the bottom of the creek. When Daniel surfaced with the boy in his arms, the people on the bridge were cheering. Someone threw down a rope and pulled them both to safety. The boy was coughing and crying, but he was alive. His mother, Sarah Brennan, wrapped her arms around him and sobbed into his hair. Later, at the hospital, Sarah asked Daniel why he'd jumped, why he'd risked his life for a child he didn't know. Daniel didn't have a good answer. He just said that sometimes you do things because you have to, because not doing them would be worse than any risk. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. She said that her husband had died 2 years earlier, trying to help someone else, trying to pull a family out of a burning building in Chicago. She said she'd thought that kind of courage was gone from the world. She said Daniel had given her hope again. After that day, something shifted in Daniel. Michael, the boy he'd saved, started visiting the lighthouse. At first, Sarah would drive him out there, worried about bothering Daniel. But Daniel told her it was fine. He liked having the boy around. Michael reminded him of something he'd forgotten, something about innocence and wonder, and the way children see possibilities where adults only see problems. Michael was fascinated by everything about the lighthouse. He wanted to know how the light worked, why Daniel had built it, what it felt like to stand at the top and look out across the wheat fields. Daniel found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining things he'd never explained to anyone. Sarah started coming too, bringing sandwiches and lemonade, sitting on the porch while Michael climbed the lighthouse stairs. She and Daniel would talk about small things at first: the weather, the town, the way the wheat changed color as the seasons passed. But gradually, as weeks turned into months, they started talking about bigger things: loss, loneliness, the way grief changes shape but never really goes away. One evening, as they sat watching the sun set over the fields, Sarah asked Daniel the question nobody else had ever asked. She asked him why he really built the lighthouse. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then, for the first time since Vietnam, he told someone the truth. He told her about the nightmares, about waking up in the dark and not knowing how to find his way back. He told her that the lighthouse was his way of surviving, his way of creating something good out of all the darkness he'd seen. Sarah listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, she reached over and took his hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Sometimes understanding doesn't require words. After that evening, Sarah and Michael became a regular part of Daniel's life. They'd have dinner together at the lighthouse once a week. Michael would help Daniel maintain the light, learning how to clean the lens and check the mechanisms. Sarah would cook meals in Daniel's kitchen, filling the house with smells that reminded him of childhood, of a time before the war when the world still made sense. Slowly, without quite realizing it was happening, Daniel began to feel something he thought he'd lost forever. He began to feel like he had a family. In the spring of 1985, Daniel asked Sarah to marry him. They were standing at the top of the lighthouse, watching the stars come out over the wheat fields, and the words just came out. Daniel hadn't planned it. He hadn't bought a ring or prepared a speech. He just looked at Sarah and knew that he didn't want to spend another day without her. Sarah said yes. She said she'd been waiting for him to ask, hoping he would, but afraid he never would. They got married a month later in a small ceremony at the base of the lighthouse, with Michael as the best man and half the town of Bridgewater in attendance. For the next 12 years, Daniel was happier than he'd ever imagined possible. He and Sarah turned the house next to the lighthouse into a real home. Michael grew up climbing those lighthouse stairs, helping Daniel maintain the light, learning to read the weather the way Daniel's father had taught him. When Michael graduated high school in 1991, he told Daniel he wanted to join the Coast Guard, wanted to work on real lighthouses. Daniel was proud. He was also terrified. The thought of Michael going away, of losing him, brought back all the old fears from Vietnam. But Sarah reminded him that you can't keep people from living their own lives, from following their own dreams. So Daniel helped Michael fill out the applications, and when Michael got accepted, Daniel was the first person to shake his hand. Michael left for basic training in the fall of 1991. The house felt empty without him, but Daniel and Sarah adjusted. They'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the lighthouse beams sweep across the wheat, and they'd read Michael's letters aloud. He wrote about his training, about the ocean, about how much he missed Montana, but how right it felt to be following in Daniel's father's footsteps. Then, in the spring of 1997, Sarah started feeling sick. At first, it was just tiredness, a general sense of not feeling quite right, but it got worse. She started losing weight. Her skin turned yellow. When they finally went to the doctor in Billings, the news was devastating. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Maybe 6 months, the doctor said. Maybe a year, if they were very lucky. Sarah took the news with the same quiet strength she'd shown that day at Miller's Creek when her car went into the water. She didn't cry or rage or ask why. She just nodded and asked what came next. Daniel, sitting beside her, felt like his world was ending for the second time in his life. They spent that last year together, in the shadow of the lighthouse. Sarah grew weaker as the months passed, but she never lost her spirit. She'd sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching Daniel work in the garden, and they'd talk about their life together. All the good times, all the unexpected moments of grace that had found them despite everything. Michael came home on emergency leave when Sarah's condition worsened. He'd been stationed at a lighthouse in Alaska, and he took a week off to be with his mother. The three of them spent hours together at the base of the lighthouse, sharing stories, laughing at old memories, pretending that they had more time than they did. One evening, Sarah asked Daniel to take her to the top of the lighthouse. She was too weak to walk, so Daniel carried her up the stairs, step by careful step, while Michael followed behind. At the top, they stood together watching the sun set over the wheat fields, the light beginning its nightly rotation. Sarah told them she wasn't afraid of dying. She said she'd already lived more than she'd expected, loved more than she deserved. She said the lighthouse had saved Daniel, but Daniel had saved her too, had given her a second chance at family and happiness after she thought those things were gone forever. Daniel held her close and tried not to cry. He wanted to be strong for her, the way she'd always been strong for him. Sarah Brennan died on a Tuesday morning in October 1998. She passed away in their bedroom with Daniel holding her hand and the light from the lighthouse streaming through the window. Her last words were about how beautiful the light looked against the wheat fields, how it reminded her of stars. After Sarah died, Daniel thought about giving up. He thought about turning off the light and walking away from everything he'd built. The lighthouse had been his way of surviving, but now it felt like a monument to everything he'd lost: his father, his friends in Vietnam, and now Sarah, the woman who'd taught him how to live again. But then Michael came back from Alaska for the funeral, and Daniel saw something in his stepson's eyes. Grief, yes, but also determination. Michael had become a lighthouse keeper, was living the dream that Daniel had once promised his own father. And Daniel realized that the lighthouse wasn't just about him anymore. It was about passing something forward, about keeping a light burning for the next generation. So Daniel kept going. Every night, he climbed those stairs and checked the light. Every morning, he woke up and found a reason to keep living. It wasn't easy. There were days when the grief felt like it would swallow him whole, when the nightmares came back with a vengeance, and he'd wake up not knowing what year it was or where all his loved ones had gone. But the lighthouse was still there. The light was still turning. And somehow, that was enough. Daniel started writing in his journal more after Sarah died. He'd sit on the porch in the evenings and write about his memories, about the lighthouse, about what it all meant. He wrote about his father and Vietnam and Sarah and Michael. He wrote about how strange it was to build a lighthouse in Montana, how everyone thought he was crazy, but how it had ended up saving his life in ways he never could have predicted. He wrote about the night he met Sarah at Miller's Creek, how jumping into that freezing water had felt like jumping back into life after years of just existing. He wrote about Michael growing up in the shadow of the lighthouse, learning the same lessons Daniel's father had taught him all those years ago in Maine. And he wrote about light, about how light is the opposite of darkness, how it's a promise that no matter how black the night gets, morning will always come. He wrote that some people need lighthouses to guide them across oceans, but others need them to guide them through the darkness inside their own souls. Michael visited whenever he could get leave. He'd spend a week at the lighthouse, helping Daniel maintain it, fixing whatever needed fixing. They'd work side by side in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that exists between people who understand each other without needing words. During one of these visits, Michael told Daniel something that made him proud in a way he'd never expected. Michael said that when he was stationed at the lighthouse in Alaska, working through storms and darkness, he'd think about the lighthouse in Montana. He said it reminded him that lighthouses weren't just about location or proximity to water. They were about hope, about refusing to give up, even when everything around you says you should. Daniel realized then that he'd succeeded in keeping his promise to his father. Maybe not in the way he'd originally intended, but in a way that mattered more. He'd spent his life keeping a light burning, guiding people home through darkness. The fact that his lighthouse stood in a wheat field instead of on a rocky coast didn't change its purpose. In his final years, Daniel became something of a local legend in Bridgewater. Tour buses started including the lighthouse on their routes through Montana. Photographers came from all over the country to capture images of this impossible structure rising up from the golden wheat. People would ask Daniel why he built it, and he'd give different answers depending on who was asking and what he thought they needed to hear. But the real answer was in his journal, in the pages he filled during those long Montana evenings, sitting on his porch with Sarah's ghost beside him and the lighthouse beam sweeping overhead. Daniel Moss died in his sleep in the spring of 2019. He was 78 years old. Michael found him 3 days later when he came to visit during his leave from a lighthouse in Washington state. Daniel was in his chair on the porch, facing the lighthouse, his journal open in his lap. He had a peaceful expression on his face that Michael had never seen when his stepfather was awake. The funeral was held at the lighthouse. More than 300 people came from all across Montana and beyond. Former soldiers who'd heard about Daniel's story, families whose children he'd inspired, people who'd visited the lighthouse over the years and been moved by the quiet determination of the man who built it. They told stories about Daniel, about his kindness, his quiet strength, the way he never gave up, even when he had every reason to. Michael spoke last, his voice breaking as he talked about the man who'd saved his life twice, once from drowning in Miller's Creek, and once from growing up without a father. Michael inherited the lighthouse. He retired from the Coast Guard and moved back to Bridgewater to take care of it full-time. He lives in the house that Daniel built, and every night he climbs those stairs to make sure the light is still turning. He started giving tours, telling visitors about Daniel and Sarah, and the unlikely love story that unfolded in the shadow of a lighthouse that never touched the ocean. The lighthouse still stands there today. If you ever find yourself driving through Montana, through those endless wheat fields that roll like waves under the big sky, you might see it in the distance. A white tower with a red stripe, its light turning faithfully through the darkness, guiding no ships but fulfilling its purpose nonetheless. In Daniel's journal, on the last page he ever wrote, dated 3 days before he died, there's a passage that Michael has framed and hung in the lighthouse. It says, "Some people think a lighthouse only matters if there's an ocean, but I learned something after all these years out here in Montana, surrounded by wheat instead of water. We're all lost sometimes. We all need a light to guide us home. And it doesn't matter if that light shines over water or wheat fields or the empty spaces in our own hearts. What matters is that it keeps turning. What matters is that someone keeps it burning even when everything says to give up. That's what my father did. That's what I tried to do. And if Michael keeps this light burning after I'm gone, Then maybe I kept my promise after all. Maybe this lighthouse, impossible as it is, means exactly what it was always supposed to mean. That even in the darkest places, even when you're lost in the middle of nowhere, with no ocean in sight and no clear way home, you can build your own light. You can create your own way back. You just have to refuse to surrender to the darkness. That's what I think about when I remember Daniel Moss and his lighthouse in the wheat fields of Montana. Not the strangeness of it, not the impossibility, but the simple act of keeping a promise across decades and distance and all the darkness that tried to stop him. He made a promise to his father at a funeral in Maine when he was 17 years old, and he kept it in ways neither of them could have imagined. We all carry promises like that, don't we? Promises we made when we were younger, when we thought we knew how our lives would unfold. Most of us break those promises or forget them, or decide they don't matter anymore. But Daniel Moss kept his. He built a lighthouse in Montana and kept the light burning for 50 years, guiding himself and others through darkness that most people never see and wouldn't understand if they did. And maybe that's the real story here. Not about lighthouses or Vietnam or even love, though all of those things matter. Maybe it's about what we do when life breaks our promises for us, when the world we expected disappears, and we're left standing in the ruins trying to figure out what comes next. Daniel could have given up. He had every reason to. But instead, he built something beautiful and impossible, something that didn't make sense to anyone, but saved his life anyway. That lighthouse still stands. The light still turns. And somewhere out there, someone driving through Montana in the middle of the night will see it and wonder why there's a lighthouse in a wheat field. They'll probably never know the answer, never hear about Daniel or Sarah or Michael, or the promise that started it all on a beach in Maine 70 years ago, but they'll see the light, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for. To build something that outlasts us. To keep a promise even when it seems impossible. To create light in the darkness and trust that someone, somewhere will need it. This is Evelyn Brooks. And that was the story of Daniel Moss and the lighthouse that never touched the ocean. Some lights guide ships through storms. Others guide us through the darkest nights of our own souls. Both kinds matter. Both kinds save lives. Good night, and may you always find your way home. Retry.